He traded her for 3 winter-thick beaver pelts, a sack of milled flour, and a rusted iron stove. Abigail stood in the freezing mud of the trading post, listening to her father haggle over her worth as if she were a sway-backed mule. She didn't cry. Crying was for pretty women, women whose tears made men uncomfortable. For Abigail, with her heavy jaw and pock-marked skin, tears only brought irritation. The mountain man just watched her, his eyes the color of bruised thunderclouds, before tossing the pelts onto the counter. The deal was done. Elias Miller didn't look his daughter in the eye when he handed over her canvas sack. It held 2 wool dresses, a pair of worn boots, and a tortoiseshell comb missing half its teeth. "It's for the best, Abby," Elias muttered to the wooden floorboards of the mercantile. The smell of pickled eggs and damp wool hung heavy in the heated air. "You're 24. Ain't no prospects here. The winters are getting harder, and I got the younger ones to feed. Gideon here, he needs keeping house." Abigail took the sack. Its coarse fabric scraped against her calloused palms. She didn't say a word. What was there to say? She had known this day was coming since she was 16, when the last of the local boys stopped looking at her entirely. Their eyes sliding past her broad shoulders, the harsh slope of her broken nose, and the faded pitting of childhood pox that scarred her cheeks. Her younger sisters were soft, doe-eyed things. They had been married off for love, or at least for respectable farmsteads. Abigail was a ledger entry, a mouth to feed that provided no return on investment. She turned to look at the man who had bought her. Gideon Locke was a mountain of a man wrapped in thick furs that smelled violently of pine pitch wood smoke and old blood. His beard was a dense, untamed thicket of dark brown and grey obscuring the lower half of his face. A deep scar slashed through his left eyebrow, pulling the skin taut. He didn't look at her with pity, nor did he look at her with the familiar, wincing disgust she was accustomed to from the townsfolk. He just looked at her. It was a flat, evaluating stare, the way a man assesses a piece of timber before deciding if it will hold the roof up. "Wagons outside," Gideon said. His voice was like stones grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. He turned and walked out the door. The mercantile bell jingled a cheerful, mocking sound. Abigail followed him into the biting November wind. The town of Oakhaven was a miserable smear of mud and timber against the foothills of the Rockies, and today it looked particularly bleak under a sky the color of old iron. Gideon had a mule hitched to a flatbed cart. He didn't offer her a hand up. He simply waited by the animal's head, adjusting a leather strap, while she clambered awkwardly onto the wooden planks, her heavy skirts twisting around her ankles. When she was seated clutching her sack to her chest, he snapped the reins. The mule lurched forward. The journey up the mountain took 4 hours. The silence between them was an absolute suffocating thing, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the wagon wheels, the dull thud of hooves on frozen dirt, and the howling wind that cut right through Abigail's thin cotton coat. She watched his broad back swaying with the motion of the cart. Panic sharp and acidic finally began to gnaw at the edges of her stoic facade. She was entirely at the mercy of this stranger. The stories women whispered about the trappers up in the high country were brutal. They lived like animals, the gossips said, and treated women worse. They bought wives just to have something warm to use when the snowed-in nights drove them mad. Abigail's fingers dug into the canvas sack. Let him try. She thought a sudden bitter spike of anger rising in her throat. She wasn't a delicate flower. She had hauled water-chopped wood and slaughtered pigs. If he came at her like a beast, she would make it difficult. The terrain grew steeper, the mud freezing into treacherous, jagged ruts. Pine trees, thick and towering, began to close in around them, blocking out the meager grey light. The air grew thinner, sharper. It smelled aggressively clean, a stark contrast to the human stink of the town down below. About halfway up, the mule slipped. The cart jerked violently to the left. Abigail was thrown hard against the side rail, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, with a sickening crack. She gasped, squeezing her eyes shut against the flare of pain. The cart stopped. She heard the heavy crunch of Gideon's boots on the frost-heaved earth. She braced herself. Her father would have yelled at her for being clumsy, for almost breaking the wood. A shadow fell over her. She opened her eyes to see Gideon standing by the wheel. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her thin, shivering frame. Without a word, he reached into the back of the wagon, pulled out a heavy, cured bear skin, and tossed it over her lap. It was heavy, smelling strongly of animal fat and smoke, but the instant warmth it provided was staggering. "Keep it tight around your neck," he grunted, turning back to the mule before she could register the shock on her face. Abigail pulled the fur up to her chin. The coarse hair tickled her scarred cheek. She watched him soothe the mule with a low clicking sound, his large, scarred hands moving with surprising gentleness over the animal's flank. She swallowed hard the bitter knot in her stomach, twisting into something entirely unfamiliar. Confusion. The cabin emerged from the tree line just as the last bruised purple light bled out of the sky. It wasn't a shack, as Abigail had feared, but a solid structure of notched logs built low to the ground to withstand the sheer weight of winter snows. A stone chimney jutted from the roof, not yet smoking. The isolation of the place was absolute. There were no neighboring lights, no distant dogs barking. Just the wind through the pines and the terrifying expanse of the darkening mountains. Gideon halted the mule and stepped down. He unhitched the animal efficiently, leading it toward a lean-to at the side of the cabin. "Go inside," he told her, gesturing with his chin toward the heavy oak door. "Latch is stiff. Put your shoulder into it." Abigail stood up, her joints screaming in protest from the cold and the hours of immobility. She wrapped the bearskin tighter around her shoulders, grabbed her canvas sack, and walked toward the door. Her boots crunched on the frozen crust of snow. She lifted the heavy iron latch, and as instructed, threw her weight against the wood. The door yielded with a groan. She stepped into pitch blackness. The air inside was stale, freezing, and smelled of old ash-tanned leather and dried herbs. She stood perfectly still just over the threshold, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. The cage. The trap. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for him to follow her in and demand what he had paid for. A minute passed. Then 2. She heard the faint sounds of Gideon moving outside, the clatter of a bucket, the rustle of hay. He was seeing to the mule. Abigail opened her eyes, letting them adjust to the gloom. She fumbled her way forward, her hands grazing a rough-hewn table, a wooden chair. The door swung open behind her, letting in a swirl of snow. Gideon stepped inside, filling the doorframe. He carried a saddlebag and an axe. He kicked the door shut behind him, plunging them back into near-total darkness. Abigail froze her breath, catching in her throat. She backed up until her hips hit the edge of the table. She heard a match strike. A spark flared, illuminating Gideon's rugged face from below, casting deep demonic shadows into the hollows of his eyes and the scar on his brow. He touched the match to a kerosene lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. Yellow light bloomed, pushing back the dark. The cabin was a single large room. A cast-iron stove sat in the center. A massive bed piled with furs dominated one corner. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserves, ammunition, and stacked firewood. It was cluttered, but meticulously clean. Gideon hung his heavy coat on a peg by the door. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the stove, opened the iron belly, and began arranging kindling with swift, practiced motions. Abigail stood by the table, her hands trembling. She felt the heavy weight of expectation pressing down on her. This was the moment. She was a wife now bought and paid for. She knew her duty, however repulsive it felt. With numb, shaking fingers, she reached up to the collar of her thin cotton coat and unfastened the top button. The metal click was loud in the quiet cabin. Gideon paused, a piece of split pine in his hand. He turned his head, looking over his shoulder at her. Abigail's chin trembled, but she forced her jaw to set tight. She unfastened the second button. Her pale, goose-pimpled flesh showed at her throat. She stared at the wall behind him, refusing to meet his eyes, waiting for the heavy footsteps, the rough hands. "What are you doing?" His voice was quiet, lacking any of the menace she anticipated. It sounded almost confused. Abigail stopped her fingers, lingering on the third button. She finally met his gaze. The bruised cloud eyes were studying her, his brow furrowed beneath the scar. She started, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat, hating the pathetic squeak of it. "I'm undressing. For you. Ain't that what you bought me for?" Gideon stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched so tight Abigail thought it might snap and cut them both. Then, very slowly, Gideon set the piece of pine down on top of the stove. He stood up to his full, towering height and walked slowly toward her. Abigail braced herself. She gripped the edge of the table behind her until her knuckles turned white. She closed her eyes. "Get it over with," she told herself. "Just endure it." She felt the warmth of him as he stopped just inches away. She smelled the pine and the smoke. Then she felt large, calloused fingers at her throat. She flinched, but the hands didn't grab her skin. Instead, clumsy but deliberate, Gideon's thick fingers grasped the edges of her coat. He pulled the fabric together. Slowly, painstakingly, he pushed the second button back through its hole. Then the first. Abigail opened her eyes, stunned. He was looking down at his hands as he worked the buttons, his face expressionless. When he finished, he smoothed the lapels of her cheap coat, flat against her chest. "Fire ain't hot yet," he said softly, his deep voice vibrating in his chest. "You'll freeze to death, girl." He took a step back, breaking the proximity. "Sit in the chair," he instructed, turning his back on her and returning to the stove. "I'll heat up some stew. You look like a stiff wind would blow you clear off the mountain." Abigail slowly sank into the wooden chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She watched him strike another match and light the kindling. The flames caught, casting a warm, dancing glow over the rough logs of the cabin. She pressed her hand flat against her chest, right where he had buttoned her coat. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt. She had prepared herself for a monster. She had armed herself with bitterness and sharp edges to survive a brute. As the smell of wood smoke and warming venison filled the small, quiet space, Abigail realized with a terrifying swoop of her stomach that she had no earthly idea how to survive a man who just wanted her to be warm. The stew was boiling hot, thick with rendered fat chunks of dark meat and withered root vegetables that tasted of the cellar dirt they'd been dug from. Gideon set a heavy hand-carved wooden bowl in front of her. It hit the table with a dull thud. Beside it he placed a wrought-iron spoon. Abigail stared at the dark, steaming surface of the broth. Grease pooled in glistening yellow circles at the edges. Her stomach gave a violent, hollow cramp. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning a piece of stale cornbread her father had shoved into her hand before they rode into town. Yet the sudden abundance felt like a trap. Farm animals were fattened before slaughter. Gideon sat across from her. He didn't offer a prayer. He didn't tell her to eat. He simply picked up his own spoon and began to consume the stew with methodical, mechanical efficiency. Abigail picked up her spoon. Her hand was still shaking, though the ambient heat from the iron stove was beginning to thaw the chill deep in her bones. She took a small bite. It burned the roof of her mouth, a sudden flare of pain that brought tears to her eyes, but the taste, rich, heavily salted, and dense with calories, overrode the burn. She swallowed, and a terrifying animal desperation took over. She ate the next bite faster. Then the next. Within 2 minutes, she was scraping the bottom of the wooden bowl, the metallic scrape of the iron spoon loud in the quiet room. She stopped, horrified at herself. She had eaten like a starved hound. Her father would have backhanded her for such a lack of manners, for showing her greed. She braced for the reprimand, clutching the spoon so tightly her knuckles ached. Gideon paused. He looked down at her empty bowl, then tipped his own, slightly scooping the remaining half of his portion into hers. "Eat." he grunted. He stood up, taking a rag from a peg near the stove and wiping his grease-shined beard. I couldn't. Abigail lied, her voice raspy. Her stomach screamed for the rest of it. You need your strength. I eat this every day. Gideon set his back to her as he opened a tin of coffee grounds. You look like you've been living on wind and spite. Eat the meat, girl. Winter up here don't tolerate weak bones. She ate the rest of the stew. She hated that she obeyed him, but the warmth spreading through her belly was a heavy, intoxicating narcotic. When she finished, the crushing weight of reality settled back onto her shoulders. The meal was over. The pleasantries, if a bowl of elk stew could be called that, were done. Now came the reckoning. She watched him move around the cabin. He possessed a startling grace for a man of his immense size. Every movement was deliberate, economic. He banked the fire, pushing the glowing orange coals to the back of the stove and adding 2 thick logs of green wood that would burn slow and steady until dawn. Outside, the wind shrieked. It sounded like something being torn in half. The cabin timbers groaned in response, but the structure felt impossibly solid. A fortress. Gideon walked to the massive bed in the corner. He pulled back the heavy stack of furs, wolf bear and buffalo, revealing a mattress stuffed with pine needles and dried grass. Abigail stood up. Her knees felt like water. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, digging her fingernails into the rough fabric of her sleeves. She walked toward the bed, her jaw set so hard, her teeth ground together. Show no fear, she thought. Just let it happen. She reached the edge of the mattress and stopped staring blankly at the rough log wall. She waited for him to step up behind her. She waited for the heavy hands to pull her down. Instead, Gideon walked past her. He moved to a wooden chest near the door, opened it and pulled out a heavy woolen blanket and a single battered canvas pillow. He threw them onto the floorboards about 4 feet from the stove. He kicked off his heavy leather boots, leaving them side by side near the door. Fully clothed save for his heavy coat, he lay down on the floor, pulling the woolen blanket up to his chest. Abigail stared at him. Her mind, so tightly wound and prepared for assault, simply misfired. What are you doing? The words slipped out before she could stop them. Gideon didn't open his eyes. He folded his thick arms behind his head. Sleeping. But the bed. She gestured uselessly at the massive pile of furs. Is yours, he said. His voice was already thick, dropping into the rhythm of exhaustion. I don't understand, she said, the panic returning sharper this time because the rules were shifting and she didn't know how to play this new game. You bought me. You paid 3 pelts and a stove for me. Gideon's eyes opened. In the dim, flickering orange light of the stove, they looked entirely black. He looked at her, standing rigid and terrified by the bed, a plain, scarred woman, readying herself for a violation she deemed inevitable. I bought a wife, Abigail, he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded strange in his mouth, rough and heavy. Not a whore. Sleep. You're going to need to chop wood tomorrow. He rolled onto his side, facing the stove, presenting his broad back to her. Abigail stood there for a long time, listening to the steady, deep rhythm of his breathing. The wind howled outside, but inside the only sound was the crackle of the wood and the beating of her own heart. Slowly, tentatively, she sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't take off her clothes. She simply pulled her boots off, swung her legs up, and crawled under the oppressive, smelling weight of the animal skins. She stared at the ceiling, waiting for the trick. It had to be a trick. Men didn't act like this, but as the hours ticked by and the fire burned down to a dull red glow, he never moved. And eventually, despite her terror and her cynicism, the sheer exhaustion of the day pulled Abigail down into a dreamless, heavy dark. She woke to a cold so profound it felt like a physical blow. Abigail gasped, sitting up quickly, clutching the buffalo hide to her chest. Her breath plumed in the air in thick white clouds. The cabin was cast in the pale blue-gray light of early dawn, filtering through the single frost-thickened window. She looked toward the stove. The fire was out, and the floor beside it was empty. Panic, familiar and sharp, spiked in her chest. She scrambled out of the bed, her stockinged feet hitting the freezing floorboards. Where was he? Had he left her? Had he realized, in the cold light of day, that he had made a terrible bargain and abandoned her here to freeze? It was exactly the sort of cruel joke her brothers would have found hilarious. She shoved her feet into her stiff boots and grabbed her coat, not bothering with the buttons. She rushed to the door, throwing her weight against it. It pushed back heavy with drifted snow, but she shoved hard, desperate. The door cracked open, spilling a blinding wash of white light and a blast of Arctic air into the room. Gideon was there. He was standing 20 yards away, waist-deep in a snowdrift, a massive double-bitted axe in his hands. He was rhythmically, mechanically splitting a massive stump of deadwood. The sound, a sharp crack echoing off the mountainsides, was deafening in the still morning air. He wore no coat, only a heavy flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms thick with muscle and corded with veins. Steam rose off his shoulders in the frigid air. He paused, lowering the axe, and looked toward the open cabin door. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just acknowledged she was awake, then swung the axe again in a brutal, perfect arc. The wood split with a violent shriek. Abigail pulled her coat tight, stepping back and pulling the heavy door shut. She leaned against the rough wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. He hadn't left her. She looked around the freezing cabin. The cold was beginning to bite into her fingers and toes. Survival instinct honed by years of being the unloved, useful beast of burden in her father's house kicked in. She knew what to do. If she wasn't a bed warmer, she was labor. She had to prove she was worth the flour and the pelts, or he might still send her back, or worse, turn her out into the snow. She moved to the stove. The iron was icy to the touch. She opened the belly. A bed of grey ash buried a few stubbornly warm embers. She grabbed the iron poker, stirring the ash to expose the glowing red coals, then carefully added a handful of dry pine needles and thin kindling from the pile stacked neatly to the right. She blew on it, gently coaxing the tiny flame until it caught the wood. Once the fire was crackling, she looked for the water bucket. It sat on a low bench near the door. She grabbed the heavy wooden handle, intending to fetch fresh water, but paused. The bucket was already full. A thick crust of ice had formed over the top. Gideon must have hauled it from the creek before she even woke. She found an iron kettle, cracked the ice in the bucket with the handle of a knife, and filled it, setting it directly onto the stove top. She needed to clean. Her father had hated dust. He said it was the mark of a lazy woman, and a lazy, ugly woman was an abomination. Abigail found a broom made of tied birch twigs in the corner. She began to sweep. The floorboards were rough, snagging the twigs, but she worked aggressively, pushing dirt-dried mud and ash towards the door. The door opened. Gideon stepped in carrying an armful of split wood that would have broken the back of a normal man. He kicked the door shut behind him, stamping the snow from his boots. The sudden influx of cold air made Abigail shiver violently. He dropped the wood with a massive clatter into the bin beside the stove. He turned, wiping snow from his brow with a calloused thumb, and watched her sweep. Abigail froze. The broom clutched tightly in her hands. She waited for him to point out a spot she missed to tell her she was holding the broom wrong. "Floor's dirt." Gideon said, his voice a low rumble. "You're just moving it from one side of the room to the other." "I'm keeping house," she said, her voice defensive, tight with anxiety. "It's what I'm here for." Gideon walked to the stove, holding his large red hands out over the warming iron. He didn't look at her. "I lived here 10 years without a woman moving my dirt around. I don't need a maid, Abigail." She gripped the broom handle tighter. "Then what do you need me for? You won't touch me. You won't let me clean. I'm not a pet to be fed stew and left in a corner." He turned his head slowly, fixing her with those flat, stormy eyes. "I need someone to watch the back door when the wolves get bold. I need someone to salt the meat when I'm tracking. I need someone who won't freeze to death when the snow traps us in here for a month straight." He looked her up and down, a purely analytical assessment. I bought you because your daddy said you were tough as a boiled boot. I need a partner to survive the winter, not a servant. Abigail stared at him. The birch broom felt suddenly ridiculous in her hands. She had been prepared to be a victim. She had been prepared to be a slave. She had not been prepared to be considered a necessity. Water's boiling. Gideon noted, gesturing with his chin towards the kettle. There's oats in the tin on the second shelf. Make it thick. He turned his back on her again, leaning down to inspect his boots for moisture. Abigail carefully set the broom back in the corner. She walked to the shelf, found the tin of oats, and brought it to the table. As she poured the grain into the boiling water, the steam rising to hit her scarred face, she realized the tight, acidic knot of fear in her stomach had subtly shifted. It wasn't gone. She didn't trust him, but the fear of a monster had been replaced by a cautious, baffling curiosity about the man standing by the stove. The first week established a rhythm forged in absolute necessity. The mountain did not care about the awkwardness between a newly bought wife and a solitary trapper. The mountain only cared that winter was coming to kill them both. They barely spoke. Words required energy, and the cold demanded every calorie they consumed. Abigail fell into the grueling work of keeping the cabin functional. She learned that Gideon was meticulous. The wood had to be stacked bark side down to dry properly. The rifles had to be oiled every third evening regardless of use. The ashpan required emptying before it choked the draft of the stove. She worked until her shoulders burned, and her hands grew a fresh layer of calluses over the old ones. She expected him to micromanage her to find fault, and follow it with a heavy hand the way her father always had. But Gideon simply watched her once, corrected her grip on the axe or the angle of the broom, and then left her to it. His silence, initially terrifying, slowly revealed itself to be just that silence. There was no coiled violence hiding behind it. On the 8th day the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low. Gideon left before dawn. Abigail spent the morning melting snow in the iron kettle, washing their spare clothes with harsh lye soap, and hanging them on a line strung near the stove. The cabin smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. He returned mid-afternoon. The door kicked open, and Gideon dragged in the gutted carcass of a mule deer. He was covered in snow, his beard frozen into solid, dirty icicles. The smell of fresh blood, sharp and metallic, cut through the heavy air of the cabin. He dropped the deer onto a thick canvas tarp in the center of the floorboards. Blood pooled immediately dark and thick. "Storm's breaking behind me!" he grunted, stripping off his heavy coat and throwing it over a chair. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under his flannel shirt. "We need this quartered and salted before nightfall, or the meat will taint in the damp." Abigail didn't hesitate. She didn't squeal or cover her mouth. Back in Oakhaven butchering day was the only time her father looked at her, with anything resembling approval, because she possessed the raw, unsentimental stomach required to break down an animal. She walked to the shelf, took down the heavy skinning knife and a bone saw. She walked back to the tarp, knelt in the spreading blood, and looked up at him. Gideon paused his hand halfway to the water bucket. He looked at her, kneeling there, her scarred face set in grim determination, a 6-inch blade in her hand. A strange, unreadable expression flickered through his dark eyes. He grabbed his own knife from his belt and knelt opposite her. They worked for hours. The only sounds were the wet tear of hide pulling away from muscle, the rhythmic rasp of the bone saw, and their synchronized breathing. It was brutal, greasy work. Abigail's hands were soon slick with hot tallow and dark blood. She separated the shoulders, slicing cleanly through the connective tissue with practiced economical strokes. Gideon watched her hands. He watched the way she didn't flinch when a pocket of gas escaped the chest cavity, the way she methodically separated the usable fat from the scrap. "Your cuts are clean," he said suddenly. His voice startled her. It was the first non-essential thing he had said all week. "My father let the boys shoot the hogs," she replied, not looking up as she sawed through a thick rib bone. "But he made me break them down, said I was better suited to the blood than the parlour." It was a bitter truth, one she usually kept swallowed down. She expected him to agree, or to offer some gruff, dismissive grunt. Gideon stopped his blade. He wiped a bloody hand across his forehead, leaving a dark smear against his pale skin. "Parlours are for people who pay others to do their bleeding for 'em," he said quietly. "Nothing honourable about being useless." He reached across the carcass. For a second, Abigail thought he was reaching for her. She went rigid, her breath catching. But he simply picked up the whetstone lying near her knee. He spat on it, ran his blade over it 3 times with a sharp shuk shuk shuk, and then held the stone out to her. She looked at the stone, then up at his face. The deep scar on his brow twitched. He wasn't pitying her. He was treating her like a partner, like an equal in the dirt and the gore. Abigail took the whetstone. Her blood-slick fingers brushed his. The contact was brief, rough, and entirely practical. Yet a sudden hot flush crept up her neck, settling in her cheeks. She ducked her head, applying the stone to her blade, deeply unnerved by the fact that the smell of blood and pine pitch was suddenly making her heart race for reasons entirely unrelated to fear. The storm Gideon predicted hit 2 hours after sunset. It didn't arrive with a howl, but with a concussive boom that rattled the heavy iron skillets hanging from the ceiling beams. The wind screamed down the mountain pass, a sheer physical force that slammed against the log walls. Inside, the temperature plummeted immediately. Abigail shoved 3 more logs into the stove, adjusting the damper until the iron belly glowed a dull, angry cherry red. The deer meat was packed away in the freezing root cellar beneath the floorboards, heavily packed in salt and cold air. By morning, the single window was completely opaque, buried under feet of drifted snow. The cabin was plunged into a perpetual, suffocating twilight. They were forced to light the kerosene lamps just to see the table. They were snowed in. The forced proximity, stripped of the distraction of outdoor chores, shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. The space felt a quarter of its actual size. Every time Abigail turned around, Gideon was there, sharpening an axe, mending a leather harness, repairing a broken snowshoe. His sheer physical mass seemed to displace the oxygen in the room. On the 3rd day of the storm, the silence began to curdle into tension. It wasn't the hostile, terrified tension of her arrival, but a strange, heavy awareness. Abigail found herself tracking his movements. She noticed the way the muscles in his back shifted under his shirt when he worked the leather awl. She noticed that he favored his left knee when he stood up quickly. She hated herself for noticing. "You are a piece of property," she reminded herself harshly, as she vigorously scrubbed a cast-iron pot that was already clean. "Don't go getting soft in the head because he hasn't hit you. You're going to scrub a hole clear through that iron." Abigail stopped. Gideon was sitting at the table, a torn snowshoe in his lap, watching her. In the yellow light of the kerosene lamp, his eyes were shadowed intense. "I like things clean," she muttered, setting the rag down. "You're anxious?" He corrected. It wasn't a question. He set the snowshoe on the table and leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "Cabin fever. It hits early when you ain't used to the dark." "I'm fine. I brought a man up here once." Gideon continued, ignoring her deflection. "Trapper from St. Louis. Big fellow. After 5 days of a whiteout, he started talking to the firewood. On the 7th day, he took a walk outside without his boots. Never found him." Abigail turned to face him, wiping her wet hands on her coarse apron. "Are you trying to scare me? I'm telling you that the mountain strips you down to the studs." He said, his voice a low, steady rumble over the shrieking wind outside. "There ain't no room for pretending up here. You're waiting for me to turn into your daddy, or whoever it was that put that flinch in your shoulders." Abigail froze. The casual observation struck her like a physical blow. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, suddenly feeling naked despite the heavy layers of wool. "You don't know anything about my father. Or me." Gideon stood up. He moved slowly, deliberately, bridging the distance between the table and the stove where she stood. Abigail's instinct screamed at her to back away, but her pride anchored her boots to the floorboards. She lifted her chin, exposing the heavy jaw and the pitted scars she despised. Let him look. Let him see exactly what he bought. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "I know he traded his own blood for a stove," Gideon said softly. "I know he looked at you like you were a bad crop he couldn't wait to plow under." Abigail's throat tightened painfully. A hot, angry tear welled in her eye, but she furiously blinked it away. "I'm ugly." She spat the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'm ugly and I'm stubborn and I was eating his food. That's all there is to it." Gideon reached out. The movement was so slow she had ample time to dodge, but she didn't. His massive, calloused hand came up, and his thick fingers gently brushed the stray hair away from her cheek, his thumb grazing the edge of her worst pockmark. Abigail shuddered, her eyes fluttering shut. Ugly is a town word. Gideon murmured, his thumb resting lightly on her jawline. "Up here a thing is either useful or it's dead. A pretty soft thing would have died in the wagon on the way up. You—" His thumb moved, mapping the slope of her jaw. "You broke down a carcass without batting an eye. You look the dark right in the face." He dropped his hand and took a step back, breaking the spell. "I bought you because I needed someone who wouldn't break when the winter hit," he said, turning his back to walk back to the table. "You ain't broken, Abigail, so stop waiting for me to treat you like you are." He sat back down and picked up the snowshoe. Abigail stood by the stove, her skin burning where he had touched her. The wind howled against the roof, but for the first time in her life the cold felt like it belonged outside. Inside, a terrifying, fragile warmth was beginning to take root, and she had no idea how to pull it like a weed. The touch lingered in the suffocating space of the cabin like a struck match that refused to burn out. For the next 2 days, the blizzard raged with a blind, screaming fury, but the atmosphere inside had fundamentally fractured. Abigail moved carefully, keeping to the edges of the room, her skin hyper-aware of the space Gideon occupied. He in turn retreated into a harsh, silent labor. He sharpened every blade they owned until they could slice floating ash. He scrubbed the iron skillets with sand and snow until his knuckles bled. It was as if he was trying to grind away the sudden, terrifying intimacy of what he had said and what he had done. Then, on the 5th morning of the whiteout, the rhythm broke. Abigail woke to a cabin that was entirely violently dark. The stove had gone cold. She scrambled out from under the heavy buffalo hides, her breath catching in her throat as the freezing air bit into her lungs. "Gideon." No answer. The wind battered the roof, but inside there was only the sound of ragged, wet breathing. She fumbled for a match on the bedside crate, her hands shaking violently from the sudden drop in temperature. She struck it against the wood. The sulfur flared, illuminating the floorboards. Gideon was still on his pallet near the stove, but he was twisted onto his side, his massive frame shivering so hard the floorboards vibrated beneath him. His heavy woolen blanket was kicked down to his knees. Abigail lit the kerosene lamp, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She rushed to him, dropping to her knees. "Gideon." She reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before pressing the back of her hand against his bearded cheek. He was burning. The heat radiating from his skin was shocking, a furnace trapped under ice. He groaned a low animal sound of pure misery, and his head rolled toward her. His bruised cloud eyes were open, but they were glassy, unfocused. The deep scar on his brow was flushed an angry red. "Fire!" he rasped, his voice sounding like torn canvas. "Keep the meat cold." "The meat is under the floor, you stubborn fool." Abigail snapped the harshness of her tone, an automatic defense against the sudden sharp spike of terror in her gut. She pulled her hand back. "You let the stove die." He didn't argue. His eyes slid shut and his jaw locked as another violent tremor seized his body. Abigail stood up. Panic, cold and familiar, tried to flood her chest. If he died, she died. It was that simple. The snow was 10 feet deep outside the door. She couldn't chop enough wood to last the winter. She couldn't track game. But beneath the practical terror of survival, another deeply annoying emotion flared. She didn't want him to die. She didn't want the man who thought she wasn't broken to stop breathing. She moved fast. She cleared the dead ash, loaded the kindling, and got a fire roaring in the iron belly within minutes. Then she turned back to Gideon. He couldn't stay on the floor. The drafts creeping under the door logs would kill him. "Gideon, get up!" She grabbed his thick shoulders, her boots finding purchase on the floorboards. "You have to get in the bed." He was dead weight, 240 pounds of dense muscle and bone completely slack. Abigail ground her teeth, her ugly, heavy jaw setting like stone. She slipped her arms under his armpits, braced her legs, and hauled. Her shoulders screamed in protest, the old, badly healed fracture from the wagon ride flaring with hot pain. "Move!" she grunted, kicking his boot with hers. "Help me, damn it!" Somewhere in his delirium, the command registered. He planted a heel, pushing back, and together they managed a clumsy, staggering crawl to the corner. He collapsed onto the pine needle mattress, dragging the heavy furs down with him. Abigail stood over him, gasping for breath, sweat pooling under her heavy wool dress despite the freezing room. He was sweating through his clothes. The heavy flannel Henley was soaked, clinging to his chest, trapping the fever heat against his core. She knew what she had to do. She had nursed her brothers through the ague, through broken bones and festering cuts. Modesty was a luxury for town folk. She knelt on the edge of the bed and unfastened the buttons of his shirt. Her hands were clumsy, her fingers trembling slightly. She pulled the heavy damp fabric apart, peeling it back from his chest. She stopped staring in the dim lamplight. She had thought her face was a ruin. Gideon's torso was a map of absolute violence. A thick roped burn scar slashed across his left pectoral. 4 parallel jagged lines, the unmistakable signature of a bear's claws, raked down his right rib cage, pale and puckered against his skin. A bullet hole, recessed and ugly, sat just below his collarbone. He looked like a man who had been fed to the mountain piece by piece and spat back out. Abigail reached for the rag she used for cleaning, dunked it in the freezing water bucket, and wrung it out. She pressed the icy cloth to his chest. Gideon flinched violently, his eyes flying open, wild and unseeing. His massive hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist with bone-crushing force. Abigail didn't scream. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his grip, bringing her face down until she was inches from his. "It's just me," she said, her voice dropping into a low, steady cadence, stripping away the harshness. "It's Abigail. I'm just washing the dirt around." His grip held for a terrifying second. He stared at her, the glassy fever breaking just enough to let the shape of her face register. The ruined cheek, the heavy jaw, the unflinching eyes. Slowly his fingers loosened. His hand dropped heavily to the mattress. "Abby." He breathed out the word, rough and exhausted. She swallowed hard, ignoring the ache in her wrist. She pressed the cold rag to his forehead. For the next 2 days she didn't sleep. She fed the fire-boiled willow bark into a bitter, dark tea and forced it down his throat drop by drop. She traded his fever for her exhaustion, fighting the mountain for his life, with the same grim, unyielding stubbornness she had used to survive her father's house. The fever broke on the morning of the 7th day. Abigail knew it before she even opened her eyes. The profound, bone-rattling silence of the cabin had changed. The wind had finally stopped screaming. She was slumped in the wooden chair beside the bed, her chin resting on her chest, wrapped in her worn cotton coat. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, toxic fatigue. Her throat was sandpaper. She blinked, forcing her heavy eyelids up, and looked at the bed. Gideon was awake. He was lying flat on his back, staring at the ceiling beams. His skin was pale, stripped of its robust, weather-beaten color, and his eyes were sunken in dark hollows. But the unnatural, glassy sheen of the fever was gone. His breathing was slow and even. He turned his head slightly, the rustle of the buffalo hide loud in the quiet room. He looked at her. He took in her slumped posture, the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes, and the empty tin cup of willow bark tea resting on her lap. "You look like hell," he rasped. His voice was incredibly weak, a shadow of its usual gravelly rumble. Abigail didn't smile. She slowly sat up straight, her joints popping in the cold air. "You owe me a new rag. I had to ruin my good one keeping your brain from boiling in your skull." Gideon didn't offer a gruff retort. He just kept looking at her. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the hostile void of their first days. It was heavy-weighted with the unspoken reality of the last 48 hours. She had seen him broken. She had touched his scars. "Storm's done," he noted quietly. "I'll dig the door out," Abigail said, pushing herself up from the chair. Her legs wobbled, but she locked her knees, refusing to show weakness. It took her an hour of grueling, back-breaking labor with the iron shovel to clear the snowdrift blocking the heavy oak door. When she finally heaved it open, the light that poured into the cabin was a physical assault. It was brilliant, blinding, and sterile white. The mountain air rushed in so violently cold it burned her lungs, but it smelled like pure pine and clean ice. She turned back to the room. The harsh sunlight illuminated every corner of the cabin, cutting through the smoky gloom. It hit the bed, illuminating Gideon's pale, drawn face. He was sitting up, leaning heavily against the log wall. He had pulled his damp Henley back together, though his fingers had lacked the strength to manage the buttons. Abigail walked to the stove, poured the last of their coffee grounds into the kettle, and set it to boil. "You shouldn't be sitting up. You lost half your weight in water." "Can't lay on my back forever," he muttered. He watched her move around the small space. "You didn't run." Abigail paused, the tin cup in her hand. She looked over her shoulder. "Run where to freeze in a snowbank? I told you I ain't stupid. You could have let the fire die, taken the pelts, waited for the spring thaw to walk out." He wasn't accusing her. He was stating facts. "And go back to my father." She turned around, entirely crossing her arms. The cynical edge returned to her voice, sharp and protective. "He'd just sell me to another camp for a sack of beans this time. At least here I know where the coffee is kept." Gideon's jaw tightened. He looked down at his massive hands, tracing a thick white scar across his knuckles. "I had a wife. Once." The words dropped into the room like lead weights. Abigail froze. Her chest constricted tightly, a sudden ugly spike of something that felt dangerously like jealousy tightening her throat. "Down in the valley, 10 years ago." Gideon continued, his voice perfectly flat. Her name was Sarah. She was something to look at. Hair like spun sugar. Small hands. He looked up, meeting Abigail's eyes. "A mining company came through, offered good money for guide work in the high passes. I took it to build her a proper house, left her in town." He paused, swallowing hard. "Winter came early, a bad one like this. I got caught in an avalanche near the summit, broke my leg, cracked my ribs, took me 2 months to drag myself back down the mountain, ate pine bark and dead mules." Abigail didn't move. She barely breathed. She could see the ghosts moving behind his bruised eyes. "When I got back to town," Gideon said, "she was gone. Took the silver I left, took the deed to the land. Left with a claim jumper who bought her silk ribbons. Said she couldn't wait around for a dead man, and she wasn't built for a hard winter anyway." He leaned his head back against the logs, closing his eyes. "Soft things rot when the frost hits. I learned that the hard way. They look pretty, but there's no spine in 'em." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Abigail, standing by the stove in her stained apron, her face deeply scarred, her shoulders broad and tense. The blinding white light from the open door hit her perfectly, hiding none of her flaws, highlighting the heavy slope of her broken nose and the pitted skin. "I didn't go into Oakhaven looking for a maid. Abigail," Gideon said softly, the gravel in his voice returning. "And I didn't buy you because you were cheap. I bought you because you stood in the freezing mud for 2 hours and you didn't shiver once. I looked at you and I saw the winter." Abigail's breath hitched. She tightened her arms across her chest, digging her fingernails into her sleeves. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her ugliness, her hardness, and called it a virtue. It terrified her. It stripped away the bitter armor she had worn for a decade. "The coffee's burning!" She choked out her voice, cracking violently. She turned her back to him, grabbing the kettle from the stove with a heavy rag. Her hands were shaking so hard she spilled boiling water on the iron, where it hissed and vanished into steam. She poured a cup black and thick as mud and walked it over to the bed. She held it out. Gideon took it, his large fingers brushing hers. The heat of the mug radiated between them. "You're a stubborn, miserable man, Gideon Locke," she said, her voice rough, hiding the tremor in her chin. He took a sip of the scalding, bitter coffee. For the very first time since she had met him, the corners of his mouth twitched beneath the thick brush of his beard. "I know," he said. "Drink your tea, Abby. We got a lot of snow to move." The mountain did not give up its grip easily. Winter fought a bitter, protracted retreat. For the next 3 weeks, Gideon remained largely confined to the chair by the stove. His body, starved and battered by the fever, required massive amounts of calories to rebuild the dense muscle he had lost. Abigail provided them. She took over the grueling outdoor chores, wrapping herself in her thin cotton coat, and Gideon's spare, oversized flannel shirts. She chopped the wood, her swings growing more accurate, the muscles in her back hardening into thick, useful cords. She hauled the water from the creek, breaking the morning ice with the flat of the axe head. She checked the snare line closest to the cabin, bringing back stringy winter rabbits that she stewed with the last of the root vegetables. She expected him to chafe at the inactivity. Men like her father turned mean when they were laid up, lashing out at the women forced to carry their weight. But Gideon didn't complain. He sat by the fire, whittling a piece of dense hickory wood with a small pocket knife, and watched her work. There was no resentment in his flat, stormy eyes, only a quiet, intense observation. By late April, the air changed. The sharp, sterile scent of deep frost gave way to the smell of wet, earth-rotting pine needles and raw, freezing mud. The creek swelled, tearing the thick ice shelves apart, with sounds like cannon fire echoing down the canyon. One afternoon, the sun hit the valley floor with a sudden, shocking warmth. The snowpack around the cabin began to melt in earnest, turning the ground into a treacherous, sucking bog. Abigail was at the chopping block, splitting the last of the dry pine. Sweat slicked the back of her neck, mixing with the wood dust. Her heavy jaw was set, her breath coming in rhythmic, white puffs. She swung the axe, burying the bit deep into the grain. The wood groaned, but didn't split. She wrenched the handle, trying to free the blade, but it was pinched tight. She grunted, planting a muddy boot on the log, and heaved. A large, scarred hand closed over hers on the ash wood handle. Abigail jumped her head, snapping up. Gideon was standing right beside her. He had walked out without his heavy coat. He looked thinner than when he had bought her the lines around his eyes, carved deeper by the winter, but the grey pallor of the sickness was entirely gone. "You're fighting the knot," he said, his voice a low, familiar rumble against the sound of the rushing creek. He didn't take the axe from her. Instead, he kept his hand over hers, adjusting her grip slightly, moving her knuckles down an inch. "Don't pull straight up. Twist your wrist to the left. Let the wedge do the work." Abigail swallowed hard. The heat of his body was a wall against her side. She could smell the lye soap on his skin and the faint, permanent scent of wood smoke trapped in his beard. She twisted her wrist, leaning her weight backward. The wood gave a sharp crack and fell cleanly into 2 halves. She let go of the axe handle, stepping back. The mud sucked at her boots. She wiped her forehead with the back of her dirty sleeve, suddenly acutely aware of how rough she looked. Her hair was a tangled, greasy mess, escaping its pins. Her face was streaked with dirt, highlighting every pockmark and the severe slope of her nose. Gideon didn't look away. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out the piece of hickory he had been whittling for the last 3 weeks. He held it out to her. Abigail took it cautiously. It was a knife handle. The wood had been sanded impossibly smooth, treated with hot tallow, until it gleamed a rich dark brown. But it wasn't a standard straight grip. It was carved with subtle asymmetrical grooves. "What is this?" she asked, her voice raspy. "For your skinning knife," Gideon said. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets. "The one you use has a handle meant for a man's grip. It blisters the webbing of your thumb. I watched you favoring it." Abigail stared at the piece of wood. She ran her thumb over the grooves. She shifted it in her hand, testing the hold. It fit perfectly. It locked into the calluses she had earned breaking down his meat and chopping his wood. It was an object designed with absolute, terrifying attention to the exact shape of her hand. It wasn't a ribbon. It wasn't a silver locket. It was a tool built for a harsh life. The heavy, cynical armor Abigail had worn for 10 years finally cracked down the center. Her chin trembled. The familiar, bitter anger she usually relied on to stop herself from crying was entirely absent. "You're a fool," she whispered, looking down at the mud so he wouldn't see her eyes water. "I cost you a stove. You don't have to carve me things." Gideon took a step forward. The mud squelched beneath his heavy boots. He reached out his thick fingers, gripping her chin, and forced her to look up. "I told you," he said, his voice stripped of all its gruffness, leaving only the raw, vibrating timbre of truth. "I bought a partner. You kept the fire burning, Abby. You kept the wolves out." He didn't ask for permission. He leaned down, bridging the gap. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was clumsy at first, a collision of chapped lips and cold air. Abigail stiffened, a lifetime of flinching, screaming at her to pull away. But his massive hands slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, anchoring her, holding her steady. He didn't rush. He didn't demand. He simply gave her the warmth of his mouth tasting of bitter coffee and salt. Abigail closed her eyes. Her hand, still holding the hickory handle, came up to grip the front of his flannel shirt. She kissed him back. It was an imperfect, desperate thing. Their teeth bumped. Her nose dug into his cheek. But as the freezing spring wind whipped around them, tearing through the pines, Abigail realized she wasn't cold at all. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Rooted in the mud, surviving the storm, held by a man who looked at her scars and saw the only thing worth keeping. If you felt the raw emotion in Abigail and Gideon's journey, let us know. This isn't your typical fairy tale. It's a story about survival grit and finding someone who values your scars just as much as your strengths. Did their rugged, imperfect romance win you over? Hit the like button if you want more deeply grounded, realistic historical dramas on the channel. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment between them, and don't forget to share this video and subscribe. Ring the bell so you never miss our next wilderness romance. Thanks for watching.